Hi everyone, welcome back to another week of Ramban ala Parsha. This week I'd like to talk about two main issues. They're both fascinating and they're both a little difficult. The first one in particular. Most of us think we know what the word chok means, and maybe we do. You know, the idea that there are mishpatim, those are the mitzvahs I understand. There are chukim, those are the mitzvahs I don't understand, or those are the mitzvahs I understand less. That's true. And yet the Ramban this week is looking for something even more. He wants to know why para aduma became the quintessential chok. Right? If you ask anybody, what's a chok? The first thing they say is para aduma. Of course it's true. But if it's not the only one, why is it so unique? Why does the Torah say zot chukat HaTorah, which literally means this is the chok of the Torah, but in a bigger sense means this is the thing that no one understands. Okay, that's one thing. The second thing which no one understands is the sin of Moshe and Aaron and the punishment at Mei Merivah. They hit the rock, they should have talked to the rock. That's another big issue that I think bothers all of us when we read the parsha, particularly because there's no hint to it. And the Ramban's going to point this out. The Ramban, who's really focused on pshat in the text, says that there's no hint to what their sin was. Okay, so let's start with the first. Zot Chukat HaTorah, which is para aduma. So first Rashi, and Rashi is famous and it makes a lot of sense. Says Rashi, Lefi shas satan v'umot ha'olam monin et Yisrael lomar ma hamitzvah azot. Right, the Satan and umot ha'olam attack us. They question us. They say, what's going on with this mitzvah? Lefikach katav b'chukah. So the Torah preempts that by saying, yeah, it's a chok. Gizerahi milifanai ve'ein lecha rishut laharher achareha. That's Rashi. Gizera. Now, literally, it probably means more than we want it to mean. Gizerahi milifanai, right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu said, it's my gzera. Ve'ein lecha rishut laharher achareha. Well, if that's the case, what we're about to do is asur. It doesn't literally mean that. It means you could wonder about it, you can think about it, but your commitment to the mitzvah is ironclad. Okay, that's Rashi. Now, says the Ramban, Ukvar katavti b'inyan sa'ir ha'mishtaleach ma ta'am le'umot sheyihiyu monin otanu b'zot yoter mishahar karbanot sheyichapru. Says the Ramban, I already told you with respect to the sa'ir ha'mishtaleach, again, on Yom Kippur, right, we bring a sa'ir bifnim, and we give to the ish iti a karban, a sa'ir, which he takes to Eretz Gezerah, and he throws it off the cliff. And it's completely bizarre. And it's more bizarre than, well, it's hard to label more or less bizarre. It's at least as bizarre as para aduma, as burning a red cow and taking the ashes and sprinkle it on somebody. So the Ramban says, what's the problem there? The problem there is you're offering a karban bachutz, right? The definition, what makes us so different from the umot ha'olam is the umot ha'olam have no single place of worship of God. We have hamakom ha'sheivcha Hashem. To bring a karban outside of the Beis Hamikdash is not just not advisable, it's asur. And here you have HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Klal Yisrael, take this karban and bring it outside of the Beis Hamikdash. Okay, so the Ramban says, that's the point. The point is, it's nizbechet lasi'irim ashahem zovchim al pnei ha'adama. It looks bad. In truth, the Ramban doesn't even think it looks bad. He thinks it is bad. The Ramban thinks on some level, I want to be careful how I say this, on some level, it is kind of a bribe to the Satan, who rules outside of the Beit HaMikdash. He rules in the desert and all these places. So the Ramban says, I mentioned it there. Now, what's so unique about para aduma? Well, V'yesh mehem sheyitaharu bekarbanot hazav v'hayoledet. It isn't even the only karban that's mitaher tumeim and maybe mitaher tahorim. It's not like that. Says the Ramban, a zav brings a karban. He was tamei, now he's tahar, right? We have this before. A yoledet brings a karban. She was tamei, now she's tahar. Okay, a person who's tamei meis brings a para aduma, and now what's unique about a para aduma? So says the Ramban, this is the point I said before. Ki mipnei heyota na'aseit bachutz Yera elahem shehi nizbechet lasi'irim al pnei asadeh. So the basic question is answered as follows. Says the Ramban, the para aduma, we don't really think of it in these terms, para aduma is not brought in the Beis HaMikdash. The para aduma is brought Kineged Pesach Ol Moed, Kineged Pesach Beis HaMikdash, on Har HaMishcha, which we know as Har HaZeitim. It's brought outside. And the Ramban says, the Gentiles look at this and they say, you're no better than us. You also bring a carbon wherever and whenever. And that's the problem. Okay? So, in a way, that's the answer to the question. Why is it a chok? What's so unique about para aduma? The answer is because it's not brought in the Beis HaMikdash, just like the Sarah Mishtalech is not brought in the Beis HaMikdash. Okay? But then the Ramban goes on, and here, maybe it's Kabbalistic. Maybe we have to be careful. We'll do our best. Says the Ramban, V'ha'emet, which is like a word when the Ramban uses, which is when he's going to change, from what we do understand to what we don't. But some of this is accessible. Shehi leha'avir ruach tum'ah usreifata kireach nichoach bachutz. Now, the Torah never describes para aduma as reach nichoach ishel Hashem. All other karbonos are brought in the Beis HaMikdash. Para aduma is not. Says the Ramban, yes it is. He doesn't use the phrase reach nichoach by accident. He means it. The way that the halacha is ma'avir ruach tum'ah is through a reach nichoach. Now comes something that seems to be wholly unrelated. V'tam tumat hamet bi'ityo shel nachash. Says the Ramban, let me explain to you something. Why is a mace mitame? What's wrong with a mace? Bi'ityo shel nachash. What does that mean? Says the Ramban, bi'ityo shel nachash means it's a hint to original sin, right? Nobody dies, and this is a big point in the Ramban and the Torah Ha'adam and all over nobody dies for no reason. Says the Ramban, people die because they sinned. Sin is mitame. Sin disgusts me. Sin, makes me recoil. That's why people die. And now the Ramban contrasts that. He says, Ki haniftarim b'nishika lo yitamu min hadin. Who is niftar b'nishika? This week's parsha. Aaron dies b'nishika. God kissed him. Now, Aaron sinned, it's true. But the sense you get in the Ramban is that when Moshe dies, when Aaron dies, when Miriam dies, when you die b'nishika, it's the opposite of dying bi'ityo shel nachash. Bi'ityo shel nachash scares me. It involves sin. To die b'nishika is the most lovely thing ever. It doesn't involve any sin. And so what's the cause of tumah, says the Ramban? The cause of tumah is sin, not death. V'hu sha'amru, a line many of us know, tzadikim einan mitamin. Right? A lot of times you meet Kohanim who go to Keva Rachel, who go to Marata Machpelah, and they say to you, kivrei tzadikim einan mitamin. This is the source. The idea is that if a person didn't die from sin, if a person died simply because God recalled them, you're not going to be katame if you go to their kever, because they're not associated with death. They're not associated with sinning. They're associated with something positive. It happens to be their time came. V'lachein amar hakatuv zot chukat HaTorah kilomar hanechkeket min HaTorah v'hi Torah sheba'al peh. I could translate the words. That's a hard sentence. But the idea is as follows. A person sins, a person dies. Right? A person doesn't sin, so why does he die b'nishika? Well, you have to go back to Brias HaOlam. What is a nishika? God gave us vayipach ba'apav nishmat chayim. The Ramban, I think it's the Ramban there who says, kol de nafach midilei nafach. If we breathe, it's God's breath within us. So nishika is like the reverse of that. God withdraws his breath from us, and we stop breathing. But that's a unique thing. It's not everybody who does it. That's only tzaddikim. Regular people sin, and they die from sin. And so said the Ramban, if we need to try this more, the chok, let me add an idea that I heard from Rav Soloveitchik once. This is not a chok in Rav Soloveitchik, but you'll permit me once. What happened in Chukas? So the answer is, it's interesting. The next parsha starts, Vayavo b'nei Yisrael kol ha'eda midbar tzin b'chodesh harishon vayeshavam b'kadesh v'tamas sham Miriam v'tikaver sham. Kol ha'eda, says Rashi, it's the 40th year. Kol ha'eda means all the people who are going to enter Eretz Yisrael are alive at this time, and they come into Eretz Yisrael. So Chukas, just in the narrative, right? Last week was year 2 of the Exodus from Egypt. Last week was the rebellion of Korach, which followed immediately, for the Ramban, on the heels of the Chet HaMeraglim. And then radio silence. 40 years, if you're just following in the parshas, 40 years just passed by in a blink, and all that happened was Chukas, right? But what does that really mean? All that happened for 40 years, said the Rav, was death. What's the real chok? The real chok is we don't understand death. It's frustrating to human beings. We can't deal with it. All of our plans are subject to this thing. It's a chok. We don't understand it. We can't understand it. All our lives we're trying to defeat it, but we can't defeat death. If you layer that on top of the Ramban and on top of the idea that I'm doing this, the tumah comes from the sin, not from the dead body, but from the sin, it starts to make more sense. That the sin is inexplicable, the death is inexplicable, the whole thing is frustrating, and therefore the whole thing becomes a chok. A chok is not just something that we don't understand. A chok is something that deeply frustrates me, that if I could, I would understand much more. If I could understand the secret of longevity, if we could understand the secret of overcoming death, we wouldn't be human anymore. It'd be unbelievable. Okay? That's the first idea. I hope I did a good enough job explaining it. It's a complicated idea, but it's a very, very worthwhile idea. Now let's go on to the story, the most important story in the parsha. So we come to Midbar Tzin in the 40th year. Miriam dies, and there it is. V'lo hayamayim lo eida vayikalu al Moshe v'al Aharon. Right? There's no water. That's where the medrash comes from. That we had a be'er b'zchut Miriam. When she died, the bear went away. Vayarav ha'ami Moshe. I wish we had died, in Egypt. Why'd you schlep us here? It's depressing because the whole point of staying 40 years in the Midbar was to not have this happen. Now it's happening again. And the sense you get is that Moshe Rabbeinu must really be depressed, right? His whole point was, okay, the Dor Yotzei Mitzrayim is not worthy to come into Eretz Yisrael. But the Dor by Haaretz, the next generation, which we're up to now, they won't sin the same way, and they do. But there's no sense of anger in the psukim. There's no sense of anger from HaKadosh Baruch Hu. You just have as follows: Vayidaber Hashem al Moshe lemor, Kach et hamateh v'akel et ha'ida ata v'yaron achicha v'dibartem el hasela le'eineihem v'natan meimav v'hotzeita lahem mayim min hasela v'ishkita et ha'ida v'et be'iram. Okay, take the mateh, talk to the rock, and then feed the people. Vayikach Moshe tamatem lifnei Hashem kashed tzivahu. Where's the sin? So far, nothing. Vayakilu Moshe v'Aaron et hakahol al pnei asala vayom elohem shimu na hamorim hamin hasel hazen otzi lachem mayim. Sin? I don't see it. Vayarem Moshe et yado vayachet hasela b'mateu pamayim. So he hits the rock. So according to Rashi, that's a sin. But it doesn't feel that way in the psukim. Vayetzu mayim rabim vatesh taido v'iram. The Ramban will say the Torah doesn't describe the sin. But the Ramban can say that there wasn't a sin, because shockingly, the next pasuk is Vayom Hashem al Moshe v'al Aaron Ya'an lo ha'emantem bi lahakdisheni l'nei bnei Yisrael lachein lo taviu takol hazeh el haaretz asher natati lahem. Apparently something terrible happened. But what was it? So the Ramban says, okay, it's Perek Chaf, it's Pasuk Aleph in the Ramban, right in the middle. It's a very long Ramban. V'hachet b'Moshe v'Aharon b'mei meriva eino mitparsem b'katov. Ramban says, I've read the Psukim many, many times. I don't find a sin. Okay, so what is it? V'Rashi peresh mipnei shetziva otam v'dibartem al hasela v'lo amar v'hikitem. Right? We all grew up with the Rashi. No, they were supposed to talk to the rock. Instead, they hit the rock. That's a chil Hashem. That was the mistake. She'ilu dibru haya HaKadosh Baruch Hu mitkadesh leinei kol ha'edah. Had they spoke to the rock instead of hitting it, there would have been a Kiddush Hashem. This is Rashi. Va'omrim uma sela zeh she'eino shomea ve'eino medaber mikayem dvoro shel HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Right, this rock that doesn't speak and doesn't hear and doesn't have feelings, he just does that with which HaKadosh Baruch Hu commanded him. Anu alachas kama v'kama. Okay, and the Ramban says v'dira agadahem. The Ramban means as an insult. V'dira agadahem means, okay, it's a nice medrash, but it doesn't really explain the psukim. But again, this is what we grew up with, right? What's the problem with the pshat, says the Ramban? Aval lo nitchavru, ki me'achar shetziva kachet hamateh yesh b'mashma sheyakebo. Why would God say to Moshe, kachet hamateh, if the point wasn't to use the mateh? Of course he had to hit the rock. V'lo haya ritzono b'dibur bilvad ma hamateh hazeh biyado. Had God wanted Moshe to just speak to the rock, why would he command him to take a stick? V'chein b'makot Mitzrayim shamar v'hamateh asher nepach l'nachash tikach biyadecha. When Moshe took the mateh in Mitzrayim, he did otot with it. The mateh was necessary. V'hu la'akot bo. V'lifamim yomar neted yadcha uritzono lomar lahakot b'mateh. Kein hakatuv yikatzer b'davar hanishma. Okay, says the Ramban. I see it all the time in Mitzrayim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to Moshe, how are you going to split the sea? Kachet hamateh, and cast it out across the water. It's all with the mateh. Why would he have set Moshe up to sin? It's a good question. And now the Ramban says, you could agree or disagree with the line. Ve'ein hanes gadol b'dibur yoter mehahaka'ah ki akol shaveh eitzel asela. Says the Ramban, I disagree with Rashi's point, the whole Kal V'chomer, that the people would say, oh, if the rock listened, then we should listen. Says the Ramban, there is no difference. A rock doesn't give water. If you speak to the rock, if you hit the rock, it's the same exact miracle. Therefore, I think Rashi's pshat, is not compelling. Let's say it that way. Okay? But all Rishonim comment on this, because this is really a fascinating topic and a fascinating issue. So Ramban's going to move on to the Rambam. And just as a side observation, on philosophic issues, the Ramban was not the biggest fan of the Rambam. Right? When the Mor Nevuchim came out, the Ramban tried to bring peace between the warring sides, but it's not as if he was a big fan of the Mor Nevuchim. He wasn't. It's funny that the parts of the Mor Nevuchim that regular people know best are all quoted by the Ramban. Now, he quotes them to disagree with them, but he did more for PR for the Mor Nevuchim than anybody else. This isn't from the Mor Nevuchim, this is from the Shmona Prakim. Once again, the Ramban's going to quote the Rambam, and then he's going to disagree. V'harav Rav Moshe savar bo svara. He has his own svara. V'amar ki Moshe Rabbeinu alav hashalom chetohu shenata litzad harag zanut. Says the Rambam, Moshe lost his temper. Ba'amro shim'una hamorim. Okay, so now what's good about this is it's textually sound, right? You look in the book, the Ramban can't disagree with it. He said shim'una hamorim. The Rambam, of course, was very, very sensitive to losing your temper. The Rambam in Hilchos Deos, when you look it up, there describes a person who loses his temper as the worst kind of person, right? Normally, we're supposed to be on the Shvil HaZahav, in the middle of two extremes. But says the Rambam there, if you have a problem with your temper, much better to overcompensate to the side where you don't react to things you should react to solve the problem with your temper than otherwise. And it comes across in this Rambam. Dikdek alav Hashem yitbarach. We're reading, it's now the Rambam. Sheyihiyeh adam kamo koes lifnei adat b'nei Yisrael b'makom she'ein bo ra'ui hakas. Says the Rambam, what was the big sin? Well, it's Moshe Rabbeinu. If Moshe Rabbeinu loses his temper in front of all of Klal Yisrael, he's not just a role model. He reflects HaKadosh Baruch Hu. It's going to have a really, really negative impact on Klal Yisrael. V'chol kiyotze b'zeh b'din ha'ishahu chilul Hashem mipnei shemitnuotav kulam umidvarav hayu lemeidim. Right? If you were in the midbar, who's your role model? Moshe Rabbeinu. There's no one else. Moshe Rabbeinu. If Moshe Rabbeinu is angry at me, there must be a reason. And says the Rambam, but why would he get angry? Now, that of course is problematic, because the Psukim make it very clear why Moshe would be angry, and I mentioned this before. When the people in the 40th year complain, like the people did in the second year, that's a tragedy. I assume Moshe really was angry, but the Rambam doesn't see it that way. Ve'eich yeira'eh alav hakas v'hu min ha'pi'ulot ha'ra'ot. Says the Ramban, one of the worst personal character traits a person can have is to get angry. V'lo tavo ki im mitchuna ra'ah mitchunot ha'nefesh. It's a terrible mistake. It's a terrible thing. And the Rambam says that's what happened to Moshe Rabbeinu. Okay? Now, first of all, the Ramban agrees that it happened. Shimuna hamorim is a phrase that's used before in the Torah. He says it doesn't necessarily mean that it was so terrible. Second, the Rambam says that if Moshe gets angry, then Klal Yisrael think to themselves, HaKadosh Baruch Hu must be angry. But there's no proof in the Psukim that HaKadosh Baruch Hu was angry. Of course, the Ramban would say, what are you talking about? Read the Psukim. The Psukim make it 1,000% clear that they were betraying God. And the Torah doesn't have to say every time that God was angry. Okay, so he disagrees with that. But now the Ramban asks another question on the Rambam, which is like, the Ramban loved Aaron. It's unbelievable how he loved Aaron. Aaron could not sin. So says the Ramban, I'll just read this line. Va'od, ki Aharon lo ka'as miyamav. Now, how does the Ramban know Aaron never got upset? Maybe his dinner was burnt one night. No, says the Ramban, Aaron HaKohen is like the biggest tzaddik ever. He never lost his temper. Ki b'shalom uva mishor halach me'odo. He always walked in peace. Va'od she'iev shelo hayakaz gadol. Then he says, Va'od she'iev shelo hayakaz gadol me'et Hashem alehem ba'asotam merivayim Moshe. They attacked Moshe. Of course God was angry. Okay. Well, let's skip a bunch. Okay, Uma pesha gadol mizeh haverav et yotzro. They challenged HaKadosh Baruch Hu. What could be a bigger sin? Why wouldn't HaKadosh Baruch Hu be angry? So, okay, for this and many, many other reasons, the Ramban rejects the Rambam's idea. The Rambam's idea is Moshe was punished because he's lost his temper for no reason. And again, Moshe Rabbeinu was not just another person. He's the representative of HaKadosh Baruch Hu in this world. If he's not a good role model for Klal Yisrael, they're all going to go off the derech, chas v'shalom. And so he's punished for that. Okay, the Ramban disagrees for the reasons I gave, and now we come to the Ramban's answer. V'hakarov min hadvarim shene'emru b'zeh. Okay, what I think is most right. V'hu tov lidchot hashoel. And at least it'll get rid of the question. Now, because the real answer is the Ramban has a Kabbalistic idea to this, which we're not going to go into because nobody understands it, or at least non-Kabbalistic people understand it, and you have to understand the following. To learn the Ramban's Kabbalah, the Ramban says in his introduction, it can be learned by people who know Kabbalah, who've received Kabbalah Rebbe to Talmud. That's not us, so we don't really know what the Ramban is. But his answer here is, you want to be docha the question, you go to Rabbeinu Chananel. Shekatuv, Rabbeinu Chananel wrote a parish on the Torah, which is lost. So we only know what the Ramban tells us, but it's pretty simple. Shekatav ki hachetu amaram Hamin hasela hazen notzi lachem mayim. What did they say? Should we take water out of this rock? V'ra'ui sheyomru yotzi Hashem lachem mayim. They should have been told, the miracle on HaKadosh Baruch Hu, and instead they were told the miracle on themselves. At least it sounds that way. V'ulai chashvu ha'am ki Moshe v'Aaron b'chachmatam. Perhaps the people thought it's a trick. Moshe Rabbeinu are really, really smart people. They do a trick. They could get water from a rock. V'zehu lo kidashtem oti. Right, the Ramban says that's the pasuk. Yan lo hamamtem bi lahakdishen lifnei bnei Yisrael. They had an opportunity to make Kiddush Hashem, but instead people assumed it was them. Hama'aseh harishon b'tzur amar hinini omed lefanecha Hashem al atzur b'chorev. The original bringing water out of the rock was done at Har Sinai, and they made it clear. V'hashivim zikenim ro'im amud ha'anan omed al atzur v'hinam v'hanes mit parsem, and everybody knows it's God. Ki ma'asa Hashem hagadolhu. Aval bikan lo ra'u davar v'ta'u b'ma'amar Moshe v'Aaron. No one saw God, and they misunderstood. The Ramban is almost sound like it's a shogeg. Moshe and Aaron didn't mean to take responsibility for it, but the way they said it led people to believe that it was them and not God. V'yitachen sheyomar bezeh ma'alatam bi, ki hane'aneh min ha'hekdesh nikra me'ilah. So when the Torah says, ma'altem bi, yeah, it's a type of me'ilah, because you took responsibility for the miracle when it was me, says HaKadosh Baruch Hu. So the Ramban is always looking for textual proofs to support the idea. V'chein miritempi, shehu tziva v'dibartem al asel le'inehem, v'hatam she'et kadesh be'inehem. I want to become sanctified in their eyes. O shenitan divarai min vatameret mishpati ki lo tziviti shetomar kacha. When they changed the text, when they decided to say that it's us doing the miracle, even though it was a mistake, says the Ramban, that was the sin. Now, is it worth the punishment? Right? This is the worst sin that Moshe and Aaron could have done. How do I know this? Because the Torah always says the reason why you're not going into Eretz Yisrael is because you sinned b'mei merivah. It's hard for me to believe, it's just me, it's hard for me to believe that this mistake that they made with the phrasing is the reason why Moshe couldn't go in, is the reason why Aaron couldn't go in. But that's the Ramban says. In absence of the Kabbalah, the Ramban says this is a good answer. The Ramban rejects both Rashi again. Rashi, who says they were supposed to speak to the rock, not hit it. The Ramban rejects it for two reasons. The primary one is he thinks there's no difference between hitting a rock and speaking to a rock. In the end, it's the rock. The Rambam thinks that it's Moshe losing his temper, that the worst thing a person could do is have a temper. And by Moshe losing his temper, it's not just a regular person losing a temper. First of all, he's a reflection of HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Second of all, there's every reason to assume that if Moshe lost his temper, HaKadosh Baruch Hu lost his temper. Says the Rambam, there's no evidence of the fact that HaKadosh Baruch Hu lost his temper. Shows up, says the Ramban, none of that is true. First of all, the rock bringing forth water out of Moshe speaking to it or hitting it, it doesn't make a difference. It's a rock. It's the same miracle. For the Rambam, it's inconceivable that God wasn't already angry. It's inconceivable that Moshe wasn't already angry. But the line, the line that they're merry, that doesn't really prove anything. Moshe's used it before. Moshe will use it again. In the end, the Ramban says the answer is, like Rabbeinu Hananel, because they phrased it in a way that they were taking responsibility for the miracle. Now, I'll just add the following. If they meant it, and maybe it's possible that after 40 years, Moshe Rabbeinu saw himself, as so connected to God, he didn't feel the need to point out the difference. Yeah, it was him bringing water out of the rock. It was with the power of God. But, after 40 years, maybe they really saw it that way. And maybe that's the sin. Maybe that's what HaKadosh Baruch Hu really has to crack down on them on. You think that you're God. You think that you're playing with all the power. I'm not letting you go into Eretz Yisrael. It's a very hard story. It's something that Mefarshim struggle with. It's something that we struggle with. Hopefully, today's Ramban helped you with that. Shabbat Shalom.